Hello. Today we will discuss the idea of risk management. And for risk management, we're going to look at a couple of different areas. We're going to look at the foundation risk management, the key elements, again, in the decision-making process. My overall goal of sport law isn't necessarily to make you all sport lawyers. However, I do want you to think like a lawyer at times and be able to make better decisions for yourself, your patrons, as well as your organization. We're going to look at different components of an emergency action plan and a crisis management plan. We're going to look at lightning safety and how can we keep those patrons and employees and spectators and players all safe. And then we're going to look at some management issues for sport facilities and those with sport disabilities. So we're going to cover a lot of different areas. Again, as you look at some of my PowerPoints, I have some different YouTube links. Certainly take a look at this, and they'll be able to flesh out some of these examples that we have. So risk management is the process of reducing or eliminating risk of injury and liability associated with recreational facilities or services. So we're looking at minimizing the risk of injury and minimizing the risk of liability, not necessarily eliminating it completely, although it would be nice at times to do that, but certainly we want to get our liability and our risk of injury to a place that can be manageable and we can lessen it as much as we can. This is the whole idea of loss prevention, the idea that we can prevent a lawsuit, prevent some sort of paying out, prevent some harm or injury, prevent loss for our organization. That could be financial, that could be a PR focus. Certainly as we look at some of these cases, although the defendant may be found not liable of some of these charges, at times we can look at perhaps it wasn't the best decision for them to act in that manner, and certainly may have taken a hit on their publicity and on their reputation. So as I said, the goal of risk management is to create an environment where the inherent risks within activities and services are minimized without producing a change in the activity itself. So we want to look at keeping the activity, however, we want to minimize those risks as much as we can. Although we can focus on inherent risks here, we certainly want to keep in mind that anytime we can minimize negligence is something we always should do. We always need to make sure that our employees, ourselves, and our organization are at least acting in the manner of the standard of the duty that we are being required of. What do? We think like a manager. We think like a risk manager. Think like an insurance company. Think like a lawyer. Think like a jury. And we put those down because those are different hats that we have to put on. If we think like a jury, how would we react? How would we find in a fact pattern such as this? An insurance company, would we insure a group? A risk manager, would we allow this activity to continue? A lawyer, is there a potential lawsuit based on this behavior? So what do? We recognize the potential risks, we analyze those potential risks, and then we act upon a course of action to minimize or eliminate those risks. Risk recognition. We're going to look at a few different areas. In fact, we can look at a whole bunch of different areas within our organization. We can do health, safety, crowd control. We look at those more probably things that come off the top of our head when we think of risk management with sport management. We can go into a stadium and we look at different areas that are potentially a lawsuit. We look at an ice machine that may be malfunctioning that puts ice on the ground. Or we can look at this idea that if a soda vendor is climbing up the stairs of our stadium and it's spilled, what's the response rate to get someone with a mop to clean it up? If it's not quick, then somebody's certainly going to slip and fall, which could cause major injury. What protocol do we have in place to get that spill cleaned up? But we also want to look at other areas. For health, one of the examples is improperly prepared food. Crowd control, certainly with seating, ticketing, and exiting. We can look at in terms of hiring people, making sure that we hire the correct person, that they don't have some sort of background that could put us at risk. Our advertising saying something clearly for us? Certainly, if we look at international sport marketing, is that advertising message translated properly, or is it something offensive or even worse for us? So when we look at risk management and we're applying it in this chapter, it may be limited to more of a facilities discussion, but it's certainly an area of law that we need to expand and think of. No matter where we go into sport management, we need to be able to use these theories in order to make ourselves and our organization stronger. First step, risk identification. We need to identify a hazard and the type of the potential liability. So first steps, we look at a couple of these different areas. Slippery floor would bring personal injuries. An uneven turf could bring personal injuries. Blocked exits could bring personal injuries. How do we identify things? We look at our objective sources, the standard of cares, our industry standards. We look at common sense. If we can think about, well, this would probably happen, we certainly want to look at, through the lens of many different people, what we expect for a behavior from an adult is certainly something we think of differently from a child who may not have a sense of boundaries, or a teenager perhaps who might often be looking to push those boundaries and do some nefarious activities. Also legal concepts. We can look at negligence and strict liability that we've discussed in previous chapters and apply it to these ideas and really see what kind of risk we have available to us. We can go through Bierman versus Notre Dame, and here we want to look at the idea of prior incidents. How does prior incident affect what we look at in terms of our duty? If an activity has happened in the past, then we are given notice that it should happen in the future, and we need to take care of it. So first we need to identify a risk. We can do that by going through a facility and taking a look at different areas. Is there a skid that goes up the ramp so that people don't have to slip? Is that wearing down? Are there exposed electrical wires near a water fountain? Is there an area on campus or in gymnasium that security can't see? Is there something dangerous? So we need to identify different risks in the first step. Second step, we need to analyze it. We need to evaluate it. We need to look at it under two different areas. One, how serious is this potential injury? Is it a stub toe? Is it potentially death? Is it a major lawsuit based on a racial or gender discrimination claim? And then we need to analyze it based on the probability of it occurring. Is it something that occurs rather frequently? If we spill ice or have an icy stairwell and people are walking up and down it, there's probability that people are going to slip very frequently. The seriousness of the injury may not be too dramatic, depending on the context of where this step or ramp is. It could cause people to fall, a far distance and could cause some catastrophic injuries. Or is it something that may not happen at all, but if it does happen, it's going to cause serious or even fatal injuries? Maybe there's a pump at the bottom of a swimming pool that's 12 feet deep, that the gate on top of it isn't secured as well as it should be. It's very doubtful. The probability could be very low that people swim down 12 feet into a swimming pool and mess around with this gate. However, if that does happen, an arm gets stuck in there, it's very likely that the time that it takes a lifeguard to notice it, to dive in, and to make a rescue might not be in enough time where serious brain injury wouldn't already have begun. And then finally, we need to take action. And action takes one of four different areas. One is retention. The response to the evaluation risks where no action is taken. The situation is kept as is. We're going to retain the risk. Perhaps it is because the risk is minimized so much that in order to change it, we would need to change the activity. For instance, we could make American football much safer. We can eliminate all of the injuries, or at least most of the injuries that occur. We could make it non-tackling. We can use flag football. we could change it and make the risk of the injury be much lower. However, that would change the inherent game so much that probably people wouldn't want to play as much, and certainly spectators wouldn't want. Not to say that that has to be our first focus, but we could eliminate risk. We're looking to retain it. If we're looking at American football, we're trying to minimize some of the risks here and there, but we still want to keep it a very fast-paced, very violent sport. We could treat the action. We could evaluate the risks where some action is taken to reduce the risk. We've done this again with American football. We've made things a little bit safer. We've eliminated certain helmet-to-helmet contact. We've protected players in certain situations where they're not protected, whether it's a quarterback in the pocket or a punt returner waiting for the ball, or making our helmets and pads more preventable for injuries. So we're looking at treating some risks here and there where we could. We could transfer the risk. That's where we take the risk and actually move it to another person. In other words, we could make a contract where we indemnify one organization where if it is a lawsuit and we're found liable, you will be paying our settlement. Or we take insurance. Insurance is a classic example of how we transfer risk. We transfer risk of our automobile accidents. If we're in an automobile accident, our insurance company will most likely pay for the damage that we caused. It's transferring. It's not eliminating the probability or the impact of the injury, but it's transferring the liability. And finally, we have complete avoidance, where we eliminate the risk. We can eliminate a lot of drunken behavior at athletic events. We just don't serve alcohol, period. We've avoided the risk. We've eliminated the action that's taken where the risk is too significant. When we're reducing the probability of risk or we're transferring it, we can use legal devices, insurance. Think about what a lawyer would recommend. And this slide isn't a specific answer. It's depending on the context of the action that we're looking at. What would a manager do? So what we've done is we've looked at these different types of risk. First, we've identified it. We've decided what the probability or frequency of the risk would be. We've also looked at the severity of it. Is it going to be minimal or significant? We've looked at 4 different types of how do we deal with it. Finally, in terms of action, we need to develop policies and procedures to take that recommendation of our analysis and actually put it into action. We need to disseminate information to every employee or volunteer. We need to look at how can we identify these risks and identify the best manner to deal with them. For instance, if we're in a sport facility, a big stadium holding 75,000 people, it's not very appropriate or it doesn't really fulfill the manner that we're looking at to have one risk manager in charge of finding every potential injury in the stadium. Let's empower our ushers to handle their specific areas. Maybe we're looking at spilling soda and ice, and we can talk to our ushers and we say, you know what? What's the best way to get this cleaned up? How can we minimize the exposure of risk of people walking up and down and potentially getting harmed? And perhaps the answer is during their activities, we can put a quick, mop and bucket with them, and they can mop it very quickly. Nothing overly clean. We can get a custodian in for that. At the very least, we should be able to give them the little sandwich boards that say caution, spilled area, until the custodian comes. We should challenge the custodians, the concessionaires, the parking attendants. Our parking lots are areas of extreme violence lately. It seems like every season we're seeing a lot of violent acts happening out there. What can we do to make this safer? Is our lighting correct? Do we need more security? One way that we can add security very easily at the end of games, if we're seeing a lot of violence, we have to look at our total capacity of our workload and see what inventory we have available to us. Well, we're closing down concession stands and merchandise stands, and making them smaller after the games. Maybe we're closing some concession stands down, and instead of having 5 people leave and clock out, maybe we take those 5 people and put the yellow vests on them, and we put them together out in the exit area. Use as a visual deterrent. We're not asking these people to go and involve themselves in some sort of activity. However, give them a walkie-talkie and a direct link to somebody. Now we're looking at a little bit more. Maybe we take some of our police officers and we use some of the activities. We get a couple more police cruisers out there, and we make sure that when the cruisers are out there, especially if it's a night game, they turn the lights on. That might minimize the activity of violent act. If you see police lights in the area, you certainly can see those lights a whole lot more than you can see a couple of people stuck in a huge crowd. Maybe that might minimize behavior. So what we want to do is communicate and update our people and challenge them to think about different areas that we can make people safer in every aspect that we're having. We want to develop that standard of care. What is that standard of care? And we want to make sure it's communicated to every employee and updated very frequently. It's not just the binder that we get when we get hired. It's meetings, it's discussions on perhaps a weekly basis. Perhaps for every game we talk a little bit about different types of scenarios that have happened. Tell us about your drunken fan and what can be done. The person who gets a little bit loud. We need to audit and inspect our facilities, not just for potential problems in the facility, but also our workers, to make sure that they are at that standard. Remember that we learned a few chapters ago, if the employee is working within the scope of their employment, then our organization will be liable. We need to uphold the standard of care. We need to make sure and require that all our employees are acting in the manner that we need them to. And we can discuss Bukowski versus Clarkson, Elledge versus Richland, Lexington School. One way to look at risk management is develop a risk management plan. 3 steps, a DIM process: develop, implement, and manage. Develop the risk management plan, implement the risk management plan, and manage the risk management plan. We're going to apply the same theory that we just talked about, identifying the risks, looking at it across all areas, not just slip and fall, and then classify it based on frequency and severity. Frequency, high, medium, low. Degree of severity, catastrophic, critical, moderate, low. We want to look at these risks. We want to identify and rank them. If there's a lot of risks that we can solve very easily and quickly, let's solve them very easily and quickly, because most often we're looking at invitees, and under an invitee we're required to fix things that we know and should know. So under this risk management plan, we are required to search out risks under that invitee standard that we have. We look at the methods or treatments for the risks: avoidance, reduction, retention, transfer. Whether we eliminate the risk, whether we try to reduce it, we take that proactive approach, or retain it. Sometimes retain is less expensive than buying insurance to cover it, or we want to transfer. Most often these aren't, complete silos. We want to have an idea that we are going to continually reduce the risk incrementally as we move forward. and we want to find different ways to transfer our liability if possible, whether that's indemnification or using independent contractors or waivers that we've talked about in different ways. We want to implement the risk. We want to involve all employees. We want to effectively communicate what we're doing. We want printed guidelines, training programs. We want to be able to encourage and support our employees to implement this plan, and B, we want to be able to show in an evidentiary procedure that we've done this. We want to make the stadium and our sport organization as safe for everyone as possible. We want to manage the risk, hiring a risk manager and a committee that is charged with going through and creating these different things and making sure we stay on top of it game after game, season after season, year after year, and getting new input and having it organic. So it's not just a plan and that's it. It's a protocol where we're looking for new ways to improve it. And we can look at Johns Hopkins versus Connecticut Sportsplex. What could have been done? What didn't need to be done and why? Certainly when we look at Johns Hopkins, we want to compare and contrast it to Behrman that we looked at a few minutes before and see how are they similar, how are they different, and why are they different? And if a lawsuit was brought against the Connecticut Sportsplex moving forward, would the same fact pattern be decided in the same way? Henneman versus Richter, a crowd control scenario that may be quite common in a number of different scenarios. And from this we can look at rushing the field or running onto the court after games and what kind of potential liability there is. As college students, we may think about that activity is very fun, and as a fan, it is. It's a great way to share in the joy. But think about it as a manager or as a potential injury attorney. There's a lot of potential injuries that could occur. Violent confrontations between a fan and the other team's coaches or players. Liability factors, climbing on a goalpost and having it fall over or falling off of it and hurting yourself or hurting someone else. Look at Henneman versus Comcast Spectacor, another crowd control incident. Did we do enough to minimize the risks of injury to a number of people? Or what could we have done? Heyman versus Pettit, a smaller case where a marketing department at a minor league baseball team put in a promotion that may have led to harming a player or a spectator or a child. Should it have happened? Should we have reined it in a little bit? Were they legally liable? This might be a case that we look at the difference between legally liable and kind of doing the right thing. Are they necessarily the same? We want to create an emergency action plan where in a potential medical emergency, does everyone know what they should be doing? And this is extremely important. There was a situation a few years ago at the Chicago Marathon. Chicago Marathon is a huge event with 30+ thousand runners and more thousands of spectators, millions of spectators actually, and thousands of volunteers. I mean, just a huge event. And part of the emergency action plan and the medical plan was to bring in ambulances from nearby suburbs because the constraint on the city of Chicago ambulances would have been too drastic. They were using them for this, so we needed to bring in some from outside the city to help support this action so that we'd have water stops every few miles and we'd have some ambulance on hand in case something would happen. The marathon was very warm and somebody was struggling, so they go to the medical tent, and the decision was that we need to take them to a hospital and give them further treatment. Good thing the plan was in place. We have a medical personnel there. We have an ambulance there. the ambulance is driving the runner. However, because of the race itself and because of the way Chicago's designed, there's a lot of one-way streets. And unfortunately, the ambulance driver could not negotiate those one-way streets to get to the hospital in time. The plan was in place. We're going to bring in additional medical personnel and ambulances. The missing key was getting them to the hospital. Now with GPS, it may be a little bit different, but we should be able at every stop. Here is a map, a printed hard copy map to this hospital, in case the ambulance driver's not quite sure how to get there. Maybe we have them come out the day before and do a dry run. Here's where you're going to be. Let's drive to the hospital. These roads are going to be blocked. There may be people here. This is what we need to think proactively. When we think of an emergency EAP issue, we look at communication, training, location of the EMS, the emergency medical staff, the role of the first responder, who's going to dial 911, who's going to document it, and education and training. Emergency care must be a part of our everyday thought process. We need to do emergency planning, appropriate personnel and injury assessment, adequate equipment or certificates, and implementation. Is it enough that we have some ambulance or some EMTs on hand, or should we have every one of our employees go through first aid training, or every one of our supervisors maybe? We have had a number of students become EMTs, and that has been a great background to get jobs in facility management, no matter where they are. If you're a risk manager, if you're running an organization, and I know that I could put one more person out there with some high-level emergency medical first aid training, that is something that I would love to do as much as I can. Emergency planning, reviewing each foreseeable emergency separately, developing an emergency response plan according to the needs. We need to predetermine plan to deal with an emergency in an organized, efficient manner. If this happens, we do this. Who's going to call for medical personnel? Who here can give first aid, give CPR? How are we going to do it? When the personnel gets here, what entrance are they going to get to? If we think of a stadium, quite often if we don't have an ambulance on staff, we need to be able to know where an ambulance is going to get to. Maybe we need to talk to the ambulance prior to our events and say, you know what, let's go over this and have a couple of people come out there who's going to be working that day. Where will you be coming? So that if we have an issue, if we have a person needing medical personnel and they're in a crowd, we can have a person go to where the EMTs are going to be arriving and be able to direct them as quickly as possible to the injured person, so that we're not searching for the EMTs and they're not searching for us. Are we on the same walkie-talkie system? Maybe when they get there, we need to give them one of our walkie-talkies, and we're going to be on channel 3, and they can communicate directly with somebody on site as they're moving there. Predetermined plan to deal with an emergency in an organized fashion. We need to plan and think about what's going to happen and what the response is going to be completely down the road. If it's after a big game and we have thousands of people and we have cars everywhere and something happens and there's an emergency and we have the medical personnel coming there, how do they negotiate through the crowd? Or if they're already on site, how do they negotiate outside? Even though they'll have their lights, it may be very difficult. Do we have to have them go the way everyone else goes, or is there a back exit or some other way quicker that they can avoid some of this traffic? Appropriate personnel and injury assessment. How can we do this? What designations is best suited to respond quickly? Who's going to respond here? Thinking of a normal big concession area, and you look at the walkway in front. If something happens here, Where's the medical personnel? How quickly will they get there? Is there anyone here that can provide some care? Even if it's, just, is there a first aid kit here? Make sure people know where it is. Where's the fire extinguisher? Where's the closest box to call for help? How do we do this? It's something we need to review every single event. Do we have adequate certifications and equipment? Do we have those fire extinguishers? Or if we use them before, we don't know where they are? Do we have backboards and first aid kits? All these need to be not only thought of, but also kept up to date. We need to know the standards that personnel has to have in first aid, CPR. Where's our automated external defibrillation machines? Do we know where they are? It's not enough just to have them, but think about the building that you're in right now. Do you know where they are? Do you know where they are in your gymnasium that you go to, or fitness facility? Here we are as sport managers and thinking like sport managers. Do we know where this is? Do we know how to use it? I know AEDs these days are very easy to be able to talk through, and most of them, at least the newer ones, are relatively self-used, and you can walk through it, especially if you've been trained on it. Have you been trained? Do you go through first aid? Do you have CPR training? Something that we should probably think about. Again, something that as you approach an internship or a job, something you can talk about no matter where you are. Certainly if you're working in some sort of capacity with potential spectators and participants. Yes, I am Red Cross or some other organization certified first aid and CPR. Yes, I do have that background. In fact, I've had to use it. And then if you have an interesting story where you've used it in the past, that is something that would stand out and provide extra benefit for you that perhaps the people competing at you for that position may not have. Adequate certifications and equipment. What do we have? Doing an audit to make sure that we have this equipment in the best possible locations. Sometimes these standard of cares are required by law. In some facilities, and this is a list that's a few years old, it includes New York, among others. It requires all health and fitness facilities to have AEDs. And I think as we're moving forward, more and more states are requiring it. Is it enough to have it? Or do we need to bring people together on a more consistent basis? Here it is, and we're going to look at it and perhaps train on it so that we know exactly how to use it. Implementation of emergency procedures, training staff, always executing it, always updating it and revising it. Putting it on an agenda. Perhaps we have a team meeting before every game and putting it on 2 or 3 times just to keep reminding people that it's important. Or every time that we do a recap, what happened in this area? How did we deal with it? How should we deal with it? And then document that and put it in a big portfolio so we have key learnings of what we should do in the future. For our crisis management plan, sometime even outside a medical idea, we need to lessen the impact. Perhaps it's public relations wise. How are we going to engage ourselves in a crisis management idea? This idea that something happens. Perhaps, an unfortunate Penn State Jerry Sandusky situation happens, or maybe not as catastrophic, but something similar in place. And the media gets on the phone and they call the athletic department, and it's very early in the morning, and you're the only one there, and you're the assistant AD, and you pick up the phone, and there is the issue. How do you respond? What are you supposed to say? How do you react? These are very common. Just because you're moving into an entry-level position doesn't mean that you're not going to be confronted with this type of information or this type of scenarios because it could happen quite frequently just because you're the one there. We need to plan for it. We need to develop an action plan. We need to look at communication. Who's going to speak for our organization if something happens in terms of maybe athlete eligibility and an NCAA investigation? Is it the coach? Is it the athletic director? Is it the campus public relations person? Is it the campus president? Who's going to respond? How are we going to respond is all something that's very important to us. Lightning is something that NADA is looking at very quickly and something that we need to adjust. We need to have a person with the authority to remove participants. Oftentimes, this is somebody on the field. The head official oftentimes has that control with perhaps a recommendation of somebody from the facility. We need to have a weather watcher. We have some great facilities now that show where lightning is in the immediate area. It's 10 miles away, 15 miles away, 100 feet away. It's coming in and talking to the field personnel often. We have a heavy storm coming in. Right now it looks like it's 30 minutes away from us. And then in a break of the action, maybe in between a series of downs or in the innings or some other time we look at it's 15, it's 10. Maybe we're playing something like soccer where it's a rather continuous game and we'll say to the official, you know what? We're going to have a person over here, we're monitoring it, and we're going to have a little sign, and we'll put, numbers up for you to look at every so often during gameplay, and we're going to be standing right here, and it's going to tell you 30 minutes away, 15 minutes away, or we should stop now. We need to monitor the lightning. We need to provide shelter and get people, if they're in the stands and there are a huge group of people, we need to move them quickly to a place where they're safe. We need to make sure that we can eliminate potential liability. We need to wait 30 minutes after the last strike. So if we wait 29 minutes and a lightning strikes, we have to wait 30 more minutes. We're going to look at disabled individuals and the ADA moving forward, but we need to look at it in terms of facility, that it bars Title III of the ADA, bars discrimination against disabled individuals, the full equal enjoyment of facilities in any place of public accommodation, meaning as we're preparing the idea and these plans of moving people into proper locations and we look at crowd control, moving people in and out safely, quickly, and efficiently, we need to plan for people in wheelchairs, blind people with support personnel, all people that could be coming to enjoy our facility or participating in our event. We need to make sure we're taking them into account to make it as quickly and efficiently as possible. We need to design the facility with reasonable modifications, making sure that people are designed, the facility is designed with their safety in mind. We need to have percentages of disabled seating in various areas around the stadium, not just in one stadium, but perhaps behind home plate, on the 50-yard line, in different areas, so that people can enjoy our facility from all different areas and watching line of sight, making sure that things are enjoyable for everyone. As we looked at risk management, we covered a lot of different scenarios, and we need people to think about it in many different areas. If you get into facility management or event management, a lot of these examples fit exactly with what you're doing. However, if you're moving into like a recreational management or therapeutic or recreational therapy idea, thinking about these same concepts is vitally important. Maybe you're in a facility that uses a lot of horses in terms of working with some special needs personnel to get them to open up and enjoy life. Well, how are you going to protect the horse? How do you recognize if a horse is spooked and potential danger? How do we handle that interaction? So the ideas of risk management, maybe you're working in human resources. How do we protect our organization in the hiring idea, of firing people, of retaining people? Do we have a situation where we have an employee that time after time after time, some allegations and complaints have been made against that person, and we keep them, and we're putting ourselves at risk? So we look at this idea of risk management from the lens of what we want to accomplish, and we still develop our identification of a risk, our analysis of risk, and how do we treat that risk. And then we think about different areas.